Hello, I'm Gary T. McDonald, author of the Gospel of Thomas the Younger, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about my take on Paul in my book. You can find a transcript of this video on medium.com under the title, Was St. Paul Gay? Again, by Gary T. McDonald. Okay, before you jump down my throat, please realize that I am not the first to suggest this. You can Google it and find that other people have written about this subject. And when I start talking about Paul's distorted personality, please don't take it as a slur on gay people. I'm talking about the ways having same-sex attraction in a society that stigmatizes and persecutes transgressive behavior may have traumatized and ultimately deranged him. I'm asking, was Paul maybe somewhat like the first century's Roy Cohn? But before I get to that, I must ask, was he in fact gay? And I know no term like that existed back then, but still the behavior existed, or there wouldn't be condemnations of it in the Bible and references to it in other classical literature. So let's start with Paul's bizarre claim in 2 Corinthians 12 that he was taken up into the third heaven, where he was given secret teachings by Jesus that he can't reveal. Then he goes on to say that he can't really boast about this because, after all, he's been given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Various scholars have theorized different infirmities as the thorn: malaria, Malta fever, which we now call brucellosis, and chronic eye problems. Then there are the cheerleaders for the theory of epilepsy and the seizures that it produces. I don't buy the first set. Paul is very candid in his writings. I don't think he would play coy with an exact explanation of his thorn if it were a mere physical health problem. The epilepsy theory is a little better, but Paul wouldn't want anybody suspecting that his dramatic collapse on the road to Damascus and his attendant vision and conversion and his crazy trip to the third heaven were the mere products of seizure dreams. But there are all these other things to consider. Jews, then, Jewish males were expected to marry and produce children. Second only to worshiping God and keeping his commandments, this was the main priority for a small sect surrounded by more powerful rivals and enemies. But extremely zealous Jew, Paul, did not marry. He claims he was extremely zealous in Galatians 1. Instead, he chose to wander around the Roman Empire for 12 years with young male partners. He didn't encourage Christians to marry unless they could not control their lust. Then they should marry. That's in 1 Corinthians 7. So lust for women could not have been Paul's thorn, or he could have easily married to relieve it. But what if relations with a wife would not have relieved it? Then there's Paul's rather strange psychology, and I've spoken about this before. Before he became Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus in what we now call Turkey. He left home to travel to Jerusalem to study with the best Pharisee teachers, and we know about that from Acts 22 and 26. The Pharisee academies were centers of rigorous logical thought, and somewhat like the Greek philosophical academies, and also they were centers of study of the Torah in Hebrew. Paul's writing shows very little evidence of logical thought. On any page in his letters, his reasoning is usually convoluted at best. And when he quotes the Torah, it is always word for word the Greek translation known as the Septuagint, rather than his own translation of the Hebrew original. One could excuse him with the explanation that he's merely arriving at the very same translation as he writes in Greek, but after well over 100 quotes, it's impossible to believe that not a single word is different from the well-known Greek translation of the time. So we must look very carefully at this claim of being a rigorous Pharisee scholar with some skepticism. And we must look at the narcissism and defensiveness of his false claim as a mark of a somewhat distorted personality. And if that it wasn't enough, look what he does next. After his however brief career as a Pharisee, he switches sides. If the Pharisees were the far-left Democrats of the time, the temple priests were the far-right Republicans, and the high priest was the chairman of the party. Suddenly, without explanation, Paul leaves the Pharisees and goes to work for the high priest. It makes me wonder if he wasn't booted from the academy and really resented it and thus joined the other side. And if that sudden change isn't weird enough, look at the job he takes on. Now, many of us have strong beliefs and judgments about what other people believe and practice in their lives, but not very many of us go out of our way in order to become active persecutors of those we disagree with. It takes a certain kind of person to join the Gestapo. Paul was that kind of guy. He seems to relish in his role as the high priest's henchman for the capturing and killing of Christians. We know this wasn't the Pharisees' attitude toward Christians, because in Act 5, their leader, Gamaliel, expresses tolerance and insists that the apostles be left alone. So Paul has jumped from one camp to the other with bloodthirsty enthusiasm. Not exactly a role model. I don't know about you, but when I see someone doing something erratic and enthusiastically violent like this, I start wondering if they aren't desperately trying to compensate for some hidden shame. And it seems they're thrashing around in life like a fish out of water, trying to get comfortable with themselves. But now Paul thrashes again. On the road to Damascus, on a persecution mission, he is struck blind and hears Jesus telling him to chill. It maybe hits him that these people he's persecuting may have an answer for him. God isn't judging us as much as he's loving us. No need for shame. God forgives us our weakness. If I was queer in the first century Palestine, that message might be very appealing. As you probably know, the Torah was not big on transgressive sexual leanings. So Paul converts and becomes now the avid Paul. Rather, Saul converts and becomes now the avid Paul. Paul becomes this super missionary traveling around with his special pal Barnabas, until Barnabas starts wanting his special pal John Mark to come along. In Acts 13, the drama is too much and John Mark splits. When their next missionary swing is being planned, Barnabas wants John Mark along, but once again, drama, big time. This time, both Barnabas and John Paul leave in a huff. Scholars insist the disagreements weren't over dogma, but they and the Bible are coy about what the real issues were. I can't read about all this without thinking about that great Steely Dan song called Gaucho. You should check it out on YouTube. It's a fun song. And for a dramatization of all of this, the story of Paul and his reaction to the mystery cults of the time, you might check into my book, The Gospel of Thomas the Younger. Thanks.